You could smell it before you opened the door. Cumin and dried chilies and corn masa, all of it drifting through a screen door held together with tape. If you grew up in a Mexican household anywhere near the Rio Grande Valley in the 1950s, that smell was not a recipe. It was a promise that your mother was turning almost nothing into something that would keep the whole family moving through another long day of fieldwork or factory shifts. These meals carried generations of knowledge across the border, and most of them cost pennies to make. One dish on this list fed entire field crews from a single pot for less than $1. Another turned an ingredient most people today would throw straight in the trash into the richest thing on the table. Here are 25 cheap meals Mexican migrant families survived on in 1950s Texas. So hit subscribe, because some of these might take you right back to a kitchen you thought you had forgotten. Number 25. Sopa de fideo. A handful of thin vermicelli noodles, a can of tomato sauce, and a clove of garlic. That was the entire grocery list for a meal that fed a family of 6. The noodles were toasted in a little oil until they turned dark golden brown and fragrant. Then the tomato sauce went in with water, garlic, and a pinch of cumin. It bubbled on the stove for 15 minutes, and by the time the tortillas were warm, dinner was ready. Children in South Texas grew up thinking sopa de fideo was a full meal, because in their house it was. Mother served it in deep bowls with a squeeze of lime and a sprinkle of queso fresco when they had it. Nothing at all when they did not. The whole pot cost less than $0.25, and the noodles were so light that even a small child could finish a bowl and ask for seconds. Sopa de fideo was not a recipe anyone wrote down. It was simply what you made when there was almost nothing left in the kitchen and a family still needed to eat. Number 24. Papas con huevo. 3 potatoes and 2 eggs could carry a family from sunrise to mid-afternoon. The potatoes were peeled, diced small, and fried in lard until they were golden and crisp on the outside. Then the eggs went in, scrambled directly into the potatoes with a little salt, and maybe a sliced jalapeno if one was growing in the yard. The whole skillet took 10 minutes. Wrapped in a flour tortilla, it became the taco that field workers carried in foil to the cotton rows and citrus groves of the Rio Grande Valley. No icebox needed because there was nothing in it that spoiled fast. Papas con huevo was breakfast, but it was also lunch and sometimes dinner, depending on what else the week had brought. It asked almost nothing of the cook and gave back enough calories to get through a full day of physical labor under the Texas sun. Number 23. Nopalitos guisados. The prickly pear cactus grew wild across South Texas, free for anyone willing to cut the pads off with a knife and scrape away the thorns. Families cleaned the pads, diced them into strips, and boiled them until the slime cooked out. Then the nopalitos went into a skillet with tomato, onion, jalapeno, and a pinch of cumin. Some families added dried shrimp during Lent to stretch it further. The finished dish had a tangy, slightly tart flavor that paired perfectly with beans and fresh tortillas. Cactus was the one ingredient that never cost a thing and never ran out, no matter how tight the budget got. Today, most people buy nopalitos already cleaned and jarred. But in the 1950s, the only supply was whatever your mother cut from the backyard. Number 22. Arroz con pollo. Sunday dinner meant one thing in most Mexican households, and it came out of a single heavy pot. A whole chicken, jointed into pieces, browned in a little lard, and then buried in a mound of rice with tomato, onion, garlic, and cumin. The rice absorbed all the flavor from the bones and turned a deep orange from the tomato. Some families dropped in a handful of peas or a diced carrot for color. Others added olives and capers, a tradition carried up from central Mexico. One pot fed 6, 7, 8 people, and the leftovers went into tortillas the next morning. The trick was toasting the rice dry in the skillet first until each grain turned translucent, so it would not clump or turn to mush under the broth. It looked like a celebration even when there was nothing to celebrate. and that was exactly why mothers made it on the days when money was shortest. Number 21. Migas. Stale tortillas never went to waste. When a stack of corn tortillas dried out and cracked, they got torn into small pieces and tossed into a hot skillet with a little lard. Once they crisped up, eggs were cracked directly over them, and the whole thing got scrambled together with tomato, onion, and serrano chile. The tortilla pieces soaked up the egg and softened just enough to hold together without going limp. Some families added a handful of shredded cheese on top while the eggs were still wet. It was a 5-minute meal that cost almost nothing and used food that would have been thrown away in any other kitchen. Field workers carried migas wrapped in foil to the cotton fields because they tasted just as good cold 4 hours later. The name itself meant crumbs, which tells you everything about where this dish came from and how little it required. Number 20. Empanadas de calabaza. Forget the fancy meat-filled empanadas sold in restaurants today. These were sweet turnovers filled with mashed pumpkin cooked down with piloncillo, cinnamon, and a pinch of anise. The dough was simple, just flour, lard, water, and a little salt, rolled thin and crimped shut with a fork. Families made them in the fall when calabaza was cheap and plentiful at the market. A single large pumpkin produced enough filling for 3 or 4 dozen empanadas, and they kept for days wrapped in cloth on the kitchen counter. Children carried them to school in their pockets, still warm from the morning fry. The filling had a deep caramel sweetness that came entirely from the piloncillo and the long, slow cooking, no refined sugar needed. In some families, these empanadas marked the start of autumn as reliably as the first cold front rolling through the valley. Number 19. Albóndigas en caldo. Meatball soup stretched a small amount of ground beef further than almost any other dish a migrant family could make. The secret was in the filler. Mothers mixed the meat with cooked rice, a beaten egg, and sometimes a handful of masa or breadcrumbs, rolling each ball between their palms until the portions looked generous, even though the actual beef content was modest. The broth was built from whatever the kitchen held: tomato, onion, garlic, a few chunks of potato, sliced calabacita, maybe a carrot or two if the season was right. The whole pot simmered for close to an hour while the meatballs poached gently and released their fat into the liquid, turning a thin vegetable broth into something rich and cloudy and feeling. 1 pound of ground beef produced enough albóndigas to fill a large olla that fed a family of 8 with bowls to spare. The potatoes and squash absorbed the meaty flavor and made each serving feel heavier than it really was. In the colonias along the South Texas border, this was the soup mothers reached for when someone came down with a cold or a fever, because the hot broth and the soft vegetables went down easy and the garlic was believed to chase illness out of the body. But albóndigas was not only a sick day remedy. It showed up on regular weeknights too, especially in the cooler months from November through February, when a warm bowl after dark felt like the only real comfort the day had offered. Children fished the meatballs out first and ate them like prizes, counting who got the most, then spooned through the broth, slowly looking for the softest pieces of potato hiding at the bottom. The leftovers thickened overnight in the icebox and came back the next day as something closer to a stew than a soup, which most families actually preferred. Nobody wrote down a recipe for albóndigas en caldo. The proportion shifted with whatever happened to be available that week, and that flexibility was the whole point of the dish. It asked for almost nothing, and returned a full pot every time. Number 18. Calabaza con puerco. When the squash came in during late summer, it showed up in everything. This dish paired chunks of calabaza with small pieces of pork, usually the cheapest cuts, stewed together in a simple broth of tomato, onion, garlic, and green chili. The pork gave the squash a rich, meaty flavor, and the squash stretched a small amount of meat into a full dinner. Corn cut fresh off the cob went in during the last few minutes. Some families added sprigs of epazote for that sharp, almost medicinal bite that you either loved or picked out of your bowl. The dish cost very little because squash grew fast and plentiful in South Texas gardens, and the pork could be whatever piece the butcher had left over at the end of the day. Number 17. Frijoles charros. Plain beans were survival. Frijoles charros were celebration disguised as survival. A pot of pinto beans simmered with bacon ends, a stub of chorizo, diced tomato, onion, jalapeno, and a fistful of cilantro thrown in at the last minute. The name came from the charros, the horsemen of rural Mexico, and the dish carried that same rough abundance. Everything in the kitchen that might otherwise go to waste found its way into the pot. Bacon rinds, a ham bone from the week before, the last inch of a chorizo link too small to fry on its own. The beans cooked down in all of that rendered fat and smoke until the broth turned dark and thick enough to coat the back of a wooden spoon. For families who could not afford a proper cut of meat, a bowl of frijoles charros with a stack of hot flour tortillas was as close to a barbecue as a Tuesday night would ever get. The dish tasted like someone had spent hours building it, and the truth was that someone had, standing over that pot stirring and adjusting the salt, because getting the broth exactly right was the one thing no shortcut in the world could replace. Number 16. Chile atole. This thick, savory corn soup confused people who had never tasted it, because it sat somewhere between atole and pozole, and did not quite fit either category. Fresh corn kernels or masa were dissolved into a warm broth with roasted poblano chiles, epazote, and sometimes a few shreds of chicken. The result was a creamy, slightly spicy porridge that stuck to your ribs on cold mornings. Chile atole was an ancient pre-Hispanic food that families carried from central Mexico to Texas as naturally as they carried their language. It required almost no money: corn, chile, water, salt. The flavor came from the roasting and the slow dissolving of the masa, not from expensive ingredients. By the 1960s, it was already becoming hard to find outside of the oldest households. Number 15. Huevos rancheros. A fried egg on a warm corn tortilla, smothered in salsa roja. That was it. The beauty of huevos rancheros was its absolute simplicity, and the fact that a dozen eggs and a few dried chilies could feed a family breakfast for an entire week. The salsa was the key. Dried guajillo chilies, toasted and rehydrated, blended with tomato and garlic into a smooth brick red sauce poured over the eggs while they were still sizzling. Some families added refried beans on the side. Others crumbled queso fresco over the top. Ranch workers ate this before dawn because it was fast, filling, and kept your hands warm while you ate. The name tells you where it came from. These were ranch eggs, food for people who worked the land and needed fuel before the sun was fully up. Diners serve a version of huevos rancheros today, with careful garnishes and avocado slices, but it has almost nothing in common with what came out of a cast iron skillet at 5 in the morning near Laredo. Number 14. Lentejas con chorizo. Lentils cooked faster than any other dried legume in the Mexican pantry, and that speed alone explained why they showed up on weeknight tables across South Texas when time and money had both run out. No overnight soaking required. Just a rinse under the faucet, straight into the pot with water, a dried bay leaf, and a smashed clove of garlic. While the lentils simmered, a skillet went on the next burner with crumbled chorizo, diced white onion, a chopped tomato, and a few thin coins of jalapeno. Once the lentils had softened but still held their shape, the chorizo mixture got stirred in, and the whole pot cooked together for another 20 minutes until the broth thickened into something halfway between a soup and a stew, stained deep reddish brown by the rendered chorizo fat. Some cooks dropped in cubes of potato to stretch the pot further, and the potato absorbed that smoky grease so completely it almost tasted like meat on its own. Others added chunks of ripe plantain for a faint sweetness that balanced the heat from the chilies. A bag of dried lentils at the local mercado cost next to nothing, and a single link of chorizo flavored the entire batch. That equation, a tiny amount of seasoned pork doing the work of a full roast, governed almost every weeknight meal migrant families in the valley managed to put on the table. You did not need much. You needed the right much. Families who had come north from Guanajuato or Zacatecas recognized this dish the moment they smelled it, because lentillas existed in nearly identical form across most of central Mexico. It was one of the few meals that tasted exactly like home, even when home was 600 miles south on the other side of the river. The dish began disappearing from regular rotation, not because anyone stopped liking it, but because canned soups became cheaper and faster, and a generation grew up thinking lentils were something only the old folks still bothered to prepare. Number 13. Tortas de camarón seco. If you grew up Catholic and Mexican in 1950s Texas, you already know what this is. During Lent, when meat was forbidden on Fridays, dried shrimp became the protein that carried families through 6 weeks of meatless meals. The shrimp came in small cellophane bags, already dried and salted, and they lasted for months in the pantry. Mothers ground them into a coarse powder, mixed them with egg and a little flour, and shaped them into small patties that were fried until golden and crispy. The patties went into a bath of caldillo, a thin tomato and chili sauce with sliced nopal cactus, and sometimes potatoes. The smell of dried shrimp frying was so strong and so distinct that neighbors knew it was Friday without checking a calendar. It was not a dish anyone would have chosen over carne asada on a regular Friday. But it was honest, filling, and it kept the faith. The recipe varied from household to household, and every family swore theirs was the right one. If your family made these during Lent, you already know that dried shrimp smell never left your hands for the rest of the day. Number 12. Chiles rellenos, a fresh poblano chile, roasted over the stove burner until the skin blistered and blackened, then peeled, split open, and stuffed with a slice of queso fresco or a spoonful of picadillo. The stuffed chile got dipped in a fluffy egg batter and fried in hot oil until the outside turned golden and the cheese inside melted into a soft, stretchy center. Chiles rellenos took more effort than most meals on this list, and that was why they showed up on special occasions, birthdays, feast days, or when a relative came to visit from across the border. A plate of 3 or 4 with a ladleful of tomato caldillo and a side of rice felt expensive, even though the ingredients cost almost nothing. The poblanos grew easily in Texas soil, and the queso came from a neighbor's cow more often than from a store. Number 11. Tripa. This is the dish that divides every family reunion in half. You either grew up loving tripas or you spent your childhood refusing to touch them. Tripa are cleaned intestines, usually from a cow, boiled until tender, and then fried on a flat comal until they turned crispy and golden on the edges. The smell was strong. There is no polite way to describe it. But the taste, when they were cooked right, was rich and chewy, with a slight crunch that was completely unlike anything else on the table. In 1950s Texas, tripas cost almost nothing because most butchers considered them waste. Mexican families saw something different. They saw a cheap protein that could stretch across a dozen tacos when chopped and served with cilantro, onion, and a squeeze of lime. Tripa were nose-to-tail eating decades before any restaurant chef turned that idea into a trend. Number 10. Mole de olla. Not the thick, chocolate-laced mole that takes 2 days to grind and blend. Mole de olla was its simpler, rougher cousin, a broth-based stew built around the cheapest beef the butcher sold. Shank bones, short ribs with more bone than meat, sometimes a hunk of neck still on the vertebra. The beef went into the pot with dried ancho and pasilla chilies that had been toasted on the comal until they blistered, soaked in hot water, and blended into a dark paste. Chunks of chayote squash, green beans snapped by hand, corn on the cob broken in half, and sliced zucchini filled out the rest. The pot simmered for hours until the broth turned deep, nearly black, and carried a smoky heat that tasted far more complex than its humble ingredients had any right to produce. Bone and connective. Tissue melted slowly into the liquid and gave it a body that no amount of seasoning could fake. The vegetables did the work of volume. The broth did the work of flavor, and the few tender bites of beef clinging to each bone gave just enough protein to make it feel like a proper meal at the end of a long day in the fields. Number 9. Asado de puerco. The word asado means roasted, but nobody in 1950s Texas was roasting anything for this dish. It was a braise, slow and patient. Chunks of pork shoulder went into a heavy pot with a sauce made from dried red chilies, usually guajillo with a few New Mexico chilies mixed in for their sweetness. The chilies were toasted until they puffed and darkened, soaked in hot water, and blended with garlic and a pinch of cumin. The pork sat in that sauce over low heat for hours until it surrendered completely, falling apart at the pressure of a fork, every piece coated in a thick, dark chile paste that clung and stained fingers and perfumed the whole kitchen. On Christmas Eve, asado de puerco was the centerpiece in many valley households. The rest of the year, it appeared whenever pork shoulder went on sale at the carniceria. A 2-pound shoulder braised in chili sauce stretched across 2 full days of eating, and the leftover sauce alone was worth saving, because it turned the next morning's scrambled eggs into something that tasted like a second feast. Number 8. Gorditas de harina. Thick, palm-sized pockets of flour dough fried in lard, until the outside cracked and the inside stayed soft and steaming. Gorditas were the original handheld meal of northern Mexico and the Texas border, older than tacos in many families and more forgiving of whatever filling happened to be available that day. The dough was simple: flour, lard, salt, warm water, sometimes a pinch of baking powder to give them a slight puff when they hit the oil. Each one was patted out by hand, thicker than a tortilla but smaller around, and fried in a shallow pool of rendered lard in a cast iron skillet. The moment they came out of the oil, a knife split them open along the seam and the filling went in. Refried beans and cheese on a lean day, chicharrones in salsa verde when the family had a little more, picadillo with potatoes when ground beef was on sale, rajas con queso when the garden produced more peppers than anyone could eat fresh. The gordita itself was the vehicle, and the vehicle cost almost nothing to build. A 5-pound sack of flour and a block of lard made enough gorditas for a week if the cook was careful with her portions. In the colonias and ranchos along the border, gorditas were what women made standing at the stove with one hand on the skillet and the other handing food directly to children as they came through the kitchen. There was no plating, no sitting down, no ceremony. Just dough, fat, heat, and whatever was left in the pantry given a shape that turned it into something whole. By the time flour tortillas became thin and machine-pressed in the decades that followed, the gordita had already started fading from daily cooking because the extra dough and frying oil felt like a luxury that thinner, quicker tortillas did not require. Number 7. Chicharrones en salsa verde. Dried pork rinds were sold in large bags at the market for almost nothing, and most people today think of them only as a snack. But in 1950s Texas kitchens, they were a cooking ingredient. The chicharrones were broken into rough pieces and dropped into a pot of salsa verde made from tomatillos, serrano chilies, garlic, and cilantro. Within minutes they absorbed the salsa and softened into something tender and almost spongy, soaking up all that tart green flavor. The dish came together in under 15 minutes and required no fresh meat because the chicharrones provided the protein and the fat. Served with rice and beans, It was a complete meal from ingredients that most families already had sitting in the pantry. The texture was unlike any other dish on this list, soft and pillowy where you expected crispy, and the verde salsa gave it a bright acidity that cut straight through the richness of the pork fat. Number 6. Birria. When someone in the family came home with a goat, the whole neighborhood paid attention. Birria was a slow-braised stew originally made with goat meat, though beef became more common in Texas, where goats were harder to find. The meat was marinated overnight in a paste of toasted guajillo, ancho, and morita chiles, mixed with vinegar, oregano, cumin, cloves, and black pepper. Then it cooked for hours until the meat shredded at the touch. The broth that formed underneath was deep red and intensely flavored, and nothing was wasted. People drank it straight from a cup, used it to dip tortillas, or ladled it over the shredded meat with raw onion and cilantro. A single goat or a cheap beef roast produced enough food for a full gathering, and the broth stretched the meal even further for anyone who showed up late. Number 5. Quilites. Before migrant families in South Texas spent a single cent at the grocery store, they looked at what was already growing for free. Quilites were wild greens, mostly lamb's quarters and amaranth leaves, that sprouted along irrigation ditches, fence lines, and the edges of cotton fields throughout the valley. Women and children gathered them in the early morning while the leaves were still cool and tender. Back in the kitchen, the greens were washed, chopped, and sautéed in a little lard with garlic and diced onion until they wilted down to a fraction of their original volume. A squeeze of lime and a pinch of salt finished the dish. Wrapped in a warm tortilla with a spoonful of beans, quelites became a full meal that had cost the family exactly nothing. The knowledge of which wild plants were safe to eat and which fields to find them in traveled from mother to daughter across generations with a precision that no printed cookbook could match. Number 4. Barbacoa. The real version, the one Mexican families made before the word became a restaurant menu item, started with a cow head. The entire head, wrapped in maguey leaves or wet burlap, was buried in a pit lined with hot mesquite coals and left to cook overnight. By morning, the meat had fallen off the bone and turned so tender it dissolved on your tongue. The cheeks were the prized cut, silky and rich. The tongue was sliced thin and piled onto tortillas. Barbacoa was always weekend food. The pit had to be dug on Friday, the fire burned down on Saturday, and the meat came out before dawn on Sunday. Families gathered at the pit in the dark, pulling meat off the bone while it was still steaming, eating the first taco standing up before the rest was wrapped and carried inside. Today, barbacoa means shredded beef in a slow cooker. It tastes fine, but it is not the same thing. Number 3. Carne guisada. This was the working man's stew, the dish that showed up in lunch pails and on dinner tables across every Mexican neighborhood in San Antonio, Laredo, and the entire Rio Grande Valley. Cheap beef, usually round or chuck, was cut into small cubes and browned with onion and garlic. Then it simmered in a gravy made from tomato, cumin, and a little flour until the meat was fork tender and the sauce clung to a tortilla without dripping. The gravy was the whole point. It turned an inexpensive cut of beef into something that tasted like it had been cooking all day. And most of the time it had. Some families added a diced potato to stretch it. Others dropped in a roasted jalapeno for heat. Every taqueria in South Texas still serves carne guisada today, and the recipe has barely changed in 70 years. Number 2. Chorizo con papas. A quarter pound of Mexican chorizo and 3 potatoes produced a skillet meal that filled a family of 6 when everything got rolled into flour tortillas. The chorizo went into the pan first, crumbled and stirred with a wooden spoon until it rendered its red-orange grease and turned crispy at the edges. Diced potatoes followed, tossed through that fat until every piece was coated and starting to brown. The pork grease from the chorizo fried the potatoes better than plain oil ever could, and the paprika and vinegar already in the sausage seasoned everything without a single extra spice from the shelf. In 1950s, South Texas, chorizo was one of the cheapest meats at the carniceria because it was made from the trimmings and offcuts nobody else wanted to buy whole. Families who could not stretch to a full pound of ground beef could always manage a single link of chorizo and a few potatoes from the bag. Wrapped in a warm flour tortilla with a spoonful of salsa roja on top, chorizo con papas tasted rich and deliberate, not like something born from necessity, but like a meal somebody had chosen on purpose. Number 1. Tamales. Nothing else on this list required as much labor or brought as many hands into one kitchen at the same time. Making tamales was not cooking in the ordinary sense. It was an assembly line that turned a household into a small factory. Somebody soaked the dried corn husks in warm water until they softened. Somebody else beat the masa with lard, working it with a wooden spoon or bare hands until a pinch of dough floated in a cup of water, the old test that proved it was light enough. Somebody prepared the filling, usually pork shoulder simmered and shredded in red chili sauce, though families with less money used bean paste, or just a strip of cheese with a slice of jalapeno. Then everyone gathered around the kitchen table, and the real work began. Spread, fill, fold, and stack. Dozens at a time, sometimes well over 100 in a single afternoon. The finished tamales stood upright in a tall tamalera with a little water at the bottom, steamed for an hour or more until the masa firmed and pulled away from the husk cleanly when you peeled one open to check. A batch that large lasted the family most of a week, reheated each morning on the comal, or eaten cold straight from the pot by children who could not wait. Extras went to neighbors, to the church, to anyone who had lent a hand during the tamalada. In migrant households across 1950s, Texas, tamales marked every Christmas, every baptism, every funeral, and most ordinary Saturdays when the women in the family decided it was time. The cost barely registered. Corn, lard, dried chilies, and whatever scrap of meat the week had left over. The real currency was time and hands willing to use them, and those were the two things these families never ran short of. If any of these meals brought back a memory, you are not alone. Millions of families across South Texas, California, and the Southwest lived on this food, and the best of it is still being cooked today in kitchens that never needed a recipe book. Tell us in the comments which meal your family made the most. If this video took you back to your abuela's table, hit like, share it with someone who remembers, and subscribe so you never miss the next one. Until next time, buen provecho.